Thank you so much. All right, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to everybody joining us on YouTube as well. My name is Liz Hansen. I'm the Director of Student Involvement and Leadership, and I'm excited to welcome you to this Town Hall and Q&A session with U.S. Representative Derek Kilmer. We're very grateful to Rep. Kilmer for making time with us today, and we look forward to some fruitful conversation. Before we get started, I would like to just give a few reminders. To keep the event flowing today, we're going to have all questions passed through one moderator, ASUWT President Jimenez. If you're joining us on YouTube, we invite you to email your questions to uwttownhall@uw.edu. We'll put this reminder in the chat as well. We're monitoring that account, the email account in the room, and we will write out your questions to pass up here to Andre. For those of you that are here with us physically in William Phillip Hall, you are also welcome to email your questions in, but then there's also some paper and pens around the room. You can write down your question and then just bring them to me. I'll be sitting at the front corner here, and we will pass them up to Andre. Depending on the volume of questions, we may condense similar topics into one broader question. So if you don't hear yours exactly as written, we're doing our best to include it with everything else. To get started, I am proud to welcome Chancellor Lange up to the stage to give a welcome. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. And to those of you who are on the live stream with us, thanks for joining in. And before we begin, we just want to acknowledge that we learn, live, reflect, and teach on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. And our campus is specifically situated on the traditional homeland of the Puyallup tribe. So we will make intentional efforts to create inclusive and respectful partnerships that honor Indigenous cultures, histories, identities, and socio-political realities. So, welcome to the University of Washington, Tacoma. We are a campus of over 5,000 students and 700 employees. 54% of our students are first in their families to go to college, and I'm a first-generation college student myself. 60% of our students are students of color, 17% are military affiliated, and most of our students, over 70%, come from Pierce, Thurston, and South King County. As a university, we pride ourselves on our small class size, engaged learning, and opportunities for our students to be involved in user-inspired research through our partnerships that address real issues in our community. This year, our student leadership, who you're going to hear from later, introduced the theme of "You Belong Here." That has now been embraced by the entire university community. And it was embraced because it speaks so eloquently to the experience that we want our students to have here at UW-T. Today's conversation with Representative Kilmer is one of those experiences that we think makes studying and working and living and learning at UW-T so unique. So thank you for joining in today. It's now my pleasure to introduce the president of ASUWT, Mr. Andre Jimenez.
Awesome. Thank you, Chancellor Lange. We're really excited to continue this series, focusing on You Belong Here and creating a sense of belonging here in Tacoma and in UW-T here specifically. So I would like to introduce our speaker. I'm going to give a quick bio. He should be no stranger to all of us, but Derek Kilmer serves as the United States Representative for Washington's 6th Congressional District, where he is focused on getting our economy and our Congress back to work. Born and raised in Port Angeles, Derek saw firsthand how the region's economy has struggled and the impact that this has had on families and communities. That's why, after college, Derek put his education into practice right here in Washington, earning over a decade of experience working in economic development in the Puget Sound region before putting his experience to work in Olympia and Washington, D.C. Derek was reelected to a 5th term in the U.S. House of Representatives in 2020 and chosen by his Democratic colleagues to serve on the House Appropriations Committee, one of only 4 exclusive committees in the House. Derek serves on the Interior and Environment Subcommittee, Defense Subcommittee, and Energy and Water Development. And it's not on here, but I know this because I'm a law and policy nerd, that he's also the chair of the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. So please give a round of applause as we welcome Derek Kilmer to the stage.
Okay. So Andre told me I could take my mask off. Is everyone cool with that? All right. I feel like I'll be a little muffled if I don't. First of all, thanks, Andre, for the great introduction, and thanks to all of the student leaders here for putting this together. Chancellor, it's also great to see you, and so grateful for your leadership of this extraordinary institution. So let me start with the obvious, and that is that we've been through a lot over these last couple of years. This pandemic has been really challenging for so many Americans, and our region has not been exempt from those challenges. Perhaps the most important decision that I made over the course of this pandemic was not any vote that I cast or any stand that I took, but it was a decision that I made that if someone reached out to my office, having lost their job or lost their business or lost a loved one as a consequence of COVID, that I would call them. And as you can imagine, I've talked with a lot of people who have really had the rug pulled out from under them. I will never forget talking to a woman in Port Angeles, where I grew up, who said, you know, Derek, I used to organize the food drive for my employer, and as a consequence of COVID, I lost my job. And for the first time in my life, I had to go to the food bank to feed my family. And so I thought about her earlier this year when Congress passed the American Rescue Plan to try to get some additional resources to families so that they could put food on their table, so that they could keep a roof over their heads. You know, I talked to a small business owner, actually not too far from here in Tacoma, who said, you know, it took me 30 years to build up my business. And he said, unfortunately, I just can't figure out how to make it. And I confess, I thought about him when we passed that American Rescue Plan earlier in the year to provide some additional resources to our local employers just to help people weather this storm. I've talked to way too many people who've lost loved ones as a consequence of this pandemic. I talked to a woman who just broke down saying, I wasn't even able to visit my husband before he passed because the hospital wasn't accepting visitors. And, you know, I am proud of the fact that the federal government has stepped up and provided some resources so that we can get vaccines into arms and hopefully get this pandemic in our rearview mirror. That's important to me. There's more that we're working on. In fact, just this last Friday, the House passed a bill called the Build Back Better Act, which I think is an important bill, and I'm sure we'll maybe talk a little bit more about it. It's important because it's a recognition that there were things that weren't working before any of us had even heard of COVID. You know, there were families that were struggling to find accessible and affordable childcare even before the pandemic, and I cannot tell you how many working parents, and particularly working moms, I've spoken with who have really struggled and feel like they've been sidelined from being able to get back to work because of the lack of affordable, accessible childcare. I cannot tell you how many families I've spoken with who've struggled with being able to afford health care, and thankfully the Build Back Better Act will lower premiums for people, will cover more people, will reduce the cost of things like insulin and prescription drugs. That's a big deal. And perhaps most germane to all of you, there are also provisions focused on workforce development and making college more affordable. I grew up in Port Angeles. My dad was a school teacher. I couldn't have gone to college if it hadn't been for financial aid. I got all of it. I got grants and I got loans, and I washed dishes in the college dining room, which my wife believes is the best skill that I learned in college. But I actually think the federal government needs to do more on this front. There are some provisions in the Build Back Better Act, including an increase in the Pell Grant, a $550 increase in the Pell Grant. I think that's progress. I would go much further than that, and I'm sure that will be one of the topics that we talk about. I do want to say, and rather than talking at you, I'd rather have a dialogue with you, so I'm going to keep my remarks reasonably brief here. I do want you to know that a lot of what I work on comes from being able to engage the people I represent, including folks on your campus. So a couple of years ago, I sat down with a group of student leaders here on campus, and I heard two things. One was that the Pell Grant wasn't adequate, and it wasn't adequate in a number of ways, that the purchasing power of the Pell had eroded over time. Two, that too often that it was at the kind of vagaries of Congress whether or not it got funded. And three, there are people who aren't eligible for the Pell who should be. For example, DACA recipients, dreamers, aren't able to access the Pell Grant. I was able to actually take that conversation and work with my colleagues to introduce a bill to fix all of those things. So our proposal would double the Pell Grant. It would make it mandatory funding rather than discretionary funding. So rather than having Congress mess with the funding, that it would be automatic. We would peg it to tuition inflation so that the Pell Grant would rise as tuition rises, and that we would make DACA recipients eligible for that. I want you to know those ideas literally came from you as students. I mean, it is a testament to your voices in our political system. The other thing that I heard when we sat down with your fellow students, this was pre-pandemic, although not far pre-pandemic. We heard just concerns around just some of the life challenges of the students here, just being able to meet basic needs. You know, I heard from some of your fellow students about the degree to which there was food insecurity, and that food pantry was set up here on campus, issues related to housing insecurity, and other items along those lines. And so I worked with some of my colleagues to write a bill called the Basic Assistance for Students in College Act that provides some help on those things, that provides funding for food assistance, that provides funding for housing assistance. Because you have enough to worry about as students, just doing your work as students. You shouldn't have to worry about how you're going to feed yourself or keep a roof over your head. And so we've introduced that bill, and I'm hopeful that we can see it move. There are other things that we've been working on with regard to things like student mental health and other things related to addressing the pandemic. But again, rather than talking at you, I'd rather hear what's on your mind. So I'm going to stop there. And then maybe when we're done with questions, you'll give me 60 seconds at the end just to give some public service announcements. So I'll stop there.
You can have as much time as you need at the end. My questions are over there, so I'll swap you. Awesome.
Maintaining 6 feet of distance.
Yes, yes. Awesome. So this is kind of in line with what you began to talk about, but one of the questions was, President Biden is in favor of tuition-free community college. What are you working to do to support this initiative?
You bet. Well, so there was a push, and I was part of this push to have that included in the Build Back Better Act, the so-called reconciliation bill. Unfortunately, so to get a bill across the finish line, it takes 218 votes in the House, 50 votes in the Senate, and a president who will sign it. Now, we have a president who will sign it. Unfortunately, we didn't have 218 in the House and 50 in the Senate. And so that provision fell out of the Build Back Better Act. But we're going to keep pushing. To me, it's important both to open, I look at education as sort of the door of economic opportunity. Here's what we know. If you care about income inequality, you should care about making sure that people have educational opportunity, because what we know is that as educational attainment goes up, so do wages. If you care about people being employed rather than unemployed, you should care about the investments we make in higher education. Because what we know is that as educational attainment goes up, so does the likelihood that someone's employed rather than unemployed. I don't know the most recent statistic on this. My knowledge of this is about 10 years old, but as of 10 years ago, in our state, if you were a high school dropout, you were 17% of our state's population and 55% of our state's prison population. I don't know about the rest of you. I would much rather invest on the front end in educating young people than on the back end in prisons and unemployment. And those are basically the decisions that we make as a society. And so part of my push as your representative is to try to make those wise investments in education, and particularly in making sure that the door of education is open for everybody, regardless of family circumstances. So what does that mean? It means, so one, I do support having tuition-free community college, but I'm for debt-free college, period, so that people aren't overly burdened by debt. The best avenue to do that is by increasing the Pell, by substantially increasing the Pell, because that is need-based. I'm not sure that any of us in the room need to subsidize Bill Gates' kids to go to college. They can probably hack it. But I can tell you that there's a lot of middle class and poorer off families in my district that really feel like the cost of education is an impediment to being able to pursue an education. We should fix that. And so one thing that we've worked on is trying to substantially increase the Pell. Two, we've been playing some defense over the years on the federally subsidized loans, which are lower rate loans. Ideally, people wouldn't have to take on loans if we had more grant-based, need-based funding. But I will tell you the value of those federally subsidized loans is their lower rate. And under the Trump administration, we had an administration that was proposing to eliminate all of those federally subsidized loans. For what it's worth, you could also refinance those. And with a lot of the higher education loans, you can't refinance, and that sticks it to students, and that's not fair. And then three, I mentioned work study. So I did work study. One of the things that we've discussed is trying to provide more avenues for work study for students in things that could actually lead to a career and that could lead to a job. You know, some universities do that. For some universities, and certainly when I was in college at my university, my work study was to be cheap labor for my university. It was fine, it helped me pay for college, but it didn't necessarily help me on a career pathway. And so one of the things that we're working on, and I've introduced legislation to do, is actually provide some incentives both for colleges and universities and for students to pursue work study opportunities that could put you on a career pathway and hopefully open the doors to some economic opportunity down the road. Sorry, I promise all of my future answers will be shorter.
No. While you're in that vein, we have another student who asked, do you think 100% student loan forgiveness will ever happen?
So the Biden administration is looking at what authorities it has to provide debt forgiveness. And there's debate about what level of debt forgiveness that they can provide. Already the Biden administration, and I very much support what they've done with regard to the public student loan forgiveness program. Under the Trump administration, and even going back before that, that public service loan forgiveness program didn't really work. It was making a lot of promises, but not actually making good on those promises. The Biden administration has made some very substantial changes that have provided basically forgiveness for student debt. That's a big deal, and it is. I've talked to constituents who have benefited from those changes that the Biden administration has undertaken. That's a life-changing thing, to go from having gobs and gobs of debt to having that debt forgiven. So the question was, do I think 100% forgiveness is in the offing? I'm not sure. And part of the reason I'm not sure is I actually thought we had a pretty good pathway to getting the free community college, and even that ran into a buzzsaw. I thought that, in my view, that's pretty uncontroversial. We have a history of universal public education in this country, K through 12. Expanding that, to me, makes sense. And yet, even that, and I don't say this in a partisan way, it's just a statement of fact. I'm not sure a single one of my Republican colleagues supported that. And to me, that's unfortunate. And so that type of buzzsaw has made me a little more skeptical as to the prospects.
Alrighty, and then let's switch gears just a little bit. So staying on providing jobs. In your work and effort to build a stronger economy and provide more jobs, how do you incorporate the need for conserving and restoring our environment, not just for humans, but the wildlife that depend on it as well?
Yeah. So I said I was going to make all my answers shorter, but this may be an exception to that. Maybe it's just useful to give you a little bit of background on how I ended up doing what I'm doing. So I grew up in Port Angeles. I was in high school when the timber industry really took it on the chin. And I saw a bunch of my friends' parents lose their jobs and a bunch of my neighbors lose their jobs. And it really altered the trajectory of my adult life. When I was in college, my senior thesis in college was how do you help timber towns in Washington State? And then did the same thing in graduate school. I looked at mining towns in the UK and timber towns here in Washington, I really tried to get my head around how do you help communities be more sustainable both environmentally and economically. For me, it's a problem if we have any communities that have to worry about their main export being young people. We need to make sure that people have economic opportunity. And I think there's this sort of false choice between environmental protection and economic development. My observation is you have to have both. And that has shaped sort of how I approach public service. And I'll give you a few examples. So one, when I got into this job, and if I'm totally honest with you, when I was running for this job in 2012, one of the things that kind of bummed me out was that the dialogue between the timber industry and the environmental community had not really advanced in the 20 years or so since I had graduated from high school. And it was sort of the Hatfields and the McCoys on opposite sides of the gymnasium throwing, flaming bags of dog poop at each other. And that wasn't good for either of them, and it wasn't good for the community. And so what we started thinking about was, how do you just reboot this? Like, how do you hit Control-Alt-Delete and figure out how we get this functional again? So we took a risk. I actually put together a meeting, and it was here. Actually, it was hosted. You all have like a little conference room. It's not this building. Maybe it's near your office, like the fourth. Is it the Don Lucian room? So we had a meeting in the Don Lucian room where we brought folks from the timber industry and from the environmental community. We kind of just sat around a table and said, this isn't working for anybody. So what if we look at doing something different? Is there some common ground to be had there? And I will tell you, we had about 6 months worth of meetings where it was mostly an exercise in trying to keep people in the room. But then we actually started kind of breaking through. We had one of the leaders in the environmental community said, you know what, I want to help you guys harvest more timber and employ more people. I just want you to do it in a way that's environmentally responsible. There are things you can do around things like ecological thinning that is good for habitat, that's good for the environment, and we would be willing to help with that. And we were here at the UWT when she said, in fact, our environmental group would be willing to put some skin in the game to hire a forester to supplement the work of the Forest Service. We just want to have a seat at the table. And we had the timber industry take the environmental community out in the woods, and we literally did field trips to look at forest treatments that were positive ecologically. And it was this kind of aha moment that you could both do something that was good for the environment and provide some more economic opportunity, even in an extractive industry with a renewable resource. I worked in economic development professionally. You look at the story of economic development here in the city of Tacoma, and it was really only once we started committing as a community to environmental restoration that we saw some of the improvements here downtown when we cleaned up Commencement Bay. We had a derelict Superfund site on Pacific Avenue with barrels of waste in it. When I started in economic development in Tacoma in the early 2000s, we literally on Pacific Avenue had a derelict site with barrels of waste in it and a chain link fence around it on Pacific Avenue. Not good for business, right? And not good for the environment. And so one of my takeaways is we can both commit to environmental protection and do so in a way that promotes job growth. Third thing I will share with you is other countries have figured this out, and probably the most important example is around addressing the climate crisis. The reality is other nations have figured out that stepping up to the climate crisis is not only important because it's an existential threat, but that it can create economic opportunity too. There are jobs to be had in industries we haven't even thought of yet, but around modernizing our electrical grid, around creating new renewable technologies, and all sorts of other things that can both be good for the planet and that can create jobs. And I care about both of those things. I represent a district where there's 3,200 people whose jobs are tied to shellfish growing and fisheries. They are seeing the impacts of the climate crisis. They are seeing changing ocean chemistry impact their ability to make a living down the road. I represent 11 Native American tribes, and 4 are coastal tribes that, as we sit here in this glorious building, they're in the process of trying to move to higher ground because of persistent flooding and more severe storms, rising sea levels, not to mention the threat of tsunami. And so, to me, we ought to be done with this sort of false choice around the environment versus the economy. The final thing I'll mention is, as we transition some communities, to me it's important that the federal government not leave those communities behind. I think that was the peril as I looked at some of the challenges that got me into this line of work in the first place. We have communities that used to be vibrant and now are not. And that's a real concern. And so one of the things I worked on, and it's actually included in the Build Back Better Act that passed out of the House on Friday, there's a pilot version of a bill I introduced that's focused on providing some flexible, long-term financial support to communities that have faced persistent economic distress. Because I think it's important for the federal government to say that you should have economic opportunity no matter what zip code you live in. So we're working on that too.
Awesome. And you
Sorry, I know that was a really long answer, but hopefully that was interesting.
No, very much so. And you touched on it a little bit, but I want to ask in a different way.
Sure.
In what specific ways do you support and uplift Indigenous voices?
You bet. So I mentioned I represent 11 Native American tribes, and one of the most important things as part of my job is having the federal government fulfill its treaty obligations and its trust responsibilities. And frankly, it hasn't done a particularly good job of that. So a few years back, I worked with, and it was driven by one of the tribal leaders in our region, but we ended up working with all of the tribal leaders in our region. A couple decades ago, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights actually issued a report called the Quiet Crisis Report. And it was a study looking at systemic failures of the federal government to uphold its trust responsibilities and its treaty obligations. When I sat down with the local tribal leaders, what they said was, not only do we need to update that report because the problem's gotten bigger, not smaller, but we need a roadmap for how the federal government could fulfill those obligations. And so I worked with the National Congress of American Indians in requesting that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights update that Quiet Crisis Report. And just 2 years ago, they came out with something called the Broken Promises Report. They did that in consultation with the tribes all around the country, but they even did a listening session in the district that I represent. And it really lays out a very stark and depressing story around everything from inequities related to education, to healthcare, to housing, to economic development, to some of these natural resource issues that we were just speaking of. But importantly, it also provides a roadmap. So what are we doing with that? Well, right now, my office is working on the House side, and we're tag teaming with Elizabeth Warren, who's leading the effort on the Senate side, to turn that Broken Promises report into legislation, to actually follow that roadmap so that we're making good on the commitments of the federal government to our tribal communities. That's probably the biggest kind of umbrella piece of this, but then there's sort of specific things under that umbrella. So I'll give you some examples. I've introduced a bill that's called the Tribal Coastal Resiliency Act, because we know we have tribes that are dealing with the impacts of climate change. Right now, there are something called coastal zone management grants, where the federal government provides funding to communities to deal with the impacts of the impacts to coastal communities of climate change. But here's the deal. There's no direct dollars that go to tribes. Right now, those dollars go to states, and then the tribes have to petition the states. Well, that's a violation of tribal sovereignty. And so we have a bill that would change that would actually provide dedicated funds specifically to tribal communities. I'll give you another example. I talked with a tribal leader in my region, in the region I represent, who said, I adopted a child who has special needs, and I adopted the child through the tribal court system. She said, did you know that in our tax code, we have something called the adoption tax credit that provides a tax credit to people who adopt a child with special needs. She said, do you know that I'm not eligible for that adoption tax credit because I adopted my child through a tribal court? Well, that's stupid, right? So we actually sponsored legislation called the Tribal Adoption Parity Act to basically provide parity, right? Like, so there's all sorts of examples like that. And then again, sort of germane to your last question, one of the most important things that we can do is uplift the treaty right. And in our neck of the woods, a lot of those treaty rights are oriented around fish, or around salmon recovery. And so a big part of my role on the Appropriations Committee is advocating for funding for salmon restoration, for Puget Sound recovery, for things like the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund and all of these various federal programs that unfortunately under the last administration had been slated for elimination, which would have been horrific, both from the standpoint of salmon recovery, but also it would have been an abdication of those treaty rights. And so we're kind of in the breach trying to advocate for that funding so the federal government makes good on those obligations.
Awesome.
Does that all make sense? Okay.
Does to me. No, thank you. We have another question from one of our faculty members here. He starts off by saying, first, thanks for supporting the reinstatement of the Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated students. As you're likely aware, most incarcerated learners complete their degree after their release. However, the Department of Education has offered little support for higher education after prison, neither for programming nor for research. Such post-prison higher education is among Chancellor Lange's top priorities for UW-T. Because with only 4% of formerly incarcerated people obtaining a bachelor's degree, it is among the most glaring inequities in higher education. His question is, are there ways the Department of Education or other federal entities can better support universities and researchers addressing this inequity?
I think it's really important, in particular, if we go back to core principles, if we look at education as the door to economic opportunity, but it's also important from the standpoint of trying to reduce recidivism, right? If we want to make sure that someone who's left incarceration is being able to pursue opportunities rather than ending up back in incarceration, it makes access to things like the Pell Grant and making sure that people can find the door of great institutions like this all the more important. Courtney is here from my team. We actually started our morning with sound outreach here in Tacoma, which does work with folks around asset building. And some of their clients are folks who are formerly incarcerated. This was actually a topic of conversation with sound outreach around how do we evangelize access to some of these resources that might help people develop more financial sustainability. And again, access to education is part of that. I would invite to your university, to your faculty, to your student body, if you have ideas about changes that can be made at the federal level, whether it be around messaging or around program eligibility or anything else, I and my team would be more than happy to be partners in that effort.
Awesome. And then another related question about another constituency group here on campus. The student writes, my question is, what support, bills, and legislation are you or your colleagues working on to support the needs of students with disabilities at the college and university level? Is there talk of the RISE Act being introduced again in Congress?
Yeah, and I formerly was a sponsor of that bill, and when it gets reintroduced, we'll sponsor it again. Again, I think if we look at both from the standpoint of everything from financial aid to wraparound services, to even some of the programs that colleges and universities run that help students succeed in a college setting, things like the TRIO program, Gear Up program, are really powerful tools in our higher education toolbox that can be valuable for students with disabilities and for first-generation students and others. I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and that puts me in a good position to be able to advocate for that funding. There are other things that we've been working on with regard to challenges for people with disabilities. for parents to have more resources when they have a young person in the house with a disability, so that they're able to get the care that they need, so they're able to get the sort of developmental assistance that they will need, so that they can live with dignity and have productive futures. There's actually provisions in the Build Back Better Act oriented towards that kind of home-based care that I think is really valuable and could pay real dividends for students here and for people who aren't students here.
Awesome. And then I think this is a really great question. Just as we start to wrap up, what advice would you give to college students who want to get more involved in politics and government?
How many of you in the room think you might want to get more involved in politics and government? Any of you? Okay, a few of you. Good. So let me answer that in a few different ways. So one, my encouragement to you is you don't have to wait to get involved. Our office offers internships. Nearly every member of my team is a UW-Tacoma alum. My district director is a UW-Tacoma alum. A number of members of our district staff, including you, right? Yeah. Courtney's a UWT alum. We really try to hire people who know our community, have been involved, and you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait. You can even get involved as students. It's not uncommon for me to get asked by young people, like, so I may want to run for office, what advice do you have? And the first thing I always say to a student who asks that is, well, what do you care about? Because my encouragement is find the things you care about and get involved in those things. And those involvements may lead you into running for office, or it may lead you to helping someone who's running for office, or it may lead you to working for an agency, or it may lead you to working for a nonprofit. But what I've observed is the people who are most impactful, who make the biggest difference in public service, are folks who know why they're there, who have kind of a mission, right? So for me, it's creating more, we have a mission statement in our office. We focus on two things. We want to make government work better for people, period. We want to make the economy work better for people. We want to make sure that people have economic opportunity. And so much of the work of our office is in the spirit of those two goals, right? You mentioned I serve on this committee to try to fix Congress. I chair a committee to make Congress work better. So please pray for me, because that's a really hard job, you guys. It's a fixer-upper. I'm engaging on that because it's part of our mission to make government work better for people. I mentioned this economic development legislation that we included. That's because that's part of our mission. That's why I'm in office, right? My background was working in economic development. Part of the reason I share my academic background is it influenced where I developed expertise and where I spend my time. What I would tell you is there are an infinite number of issues that need your help. We have people who need housing, and if your passion is for that, get engaged, right? There are organizations throughout our community that could use your help. We need to make sure people have clean air and clean water, and that we protect this earth that we pass on to the next generation. If you care about that, there are organizations that need your help. We need to make sure that people have health care. We need to make sure that we protect our democracy, right? I think we have seen, unfortunately, time and again in recent years, just how fragile this is. I certainly saw it up close and personally on the 6th of January, just how fragile this all is. And if that's something you care about, you have an opportunity to get involved in organizations that are trying to drive progress on that. I'm a dad. I think about a lot of these issues through the lens of what I want for my kids, right? I want them to grow up in a world where discrimination is a thing of the past, where regardless of your race or your religion or your ethnicity or your gender or your sexual orientation or gender identity or your ability or disability, that you are valued. I want that for my kids. And there are organizations in this community throughout this country that are geared towards working on those issues too. So there's, as I said, there's sort of an infinite number of issues and organizations that may drive your passion to serve. And my encouragement to you is get involved with those. What it means is, then if you choose to run for office, you'll have developed some expertise on those issues that you care about. It also means when you're standing on somebody's porch asking for their vote, and they say, well, what do you care about? And you tell them, and then they say, well, how do you know anything about that topic? And you tell them, you got something to say, right? I mean, when I was standing on people's porches saying, hey, I'm running for the state legislature way back when, and I said, what I care about is making sure people have economic opportunity. And they said, well, what do you know about that? And I said, well, I work in economic development professionally. They were like, well, that sounds pretty good. You know, and I would say, like, I want to make sure more people have opportunity to get a good education. And they say, well, what do you know about that? I said, well, I'm on the board of Tacoma Community College. You know, I serve on the board of communities and schools. I'm on the board of the Peninsula Schools Education Foundation. And here's what I've observed through those involvements. You know, by and large, the people I was talking to said, well, seems like you know what you're talking about, right? So that's my advice to young people who are interested in running for office is, if you have passions, develop, you know, sort of build muscle around those things that you care about, and it will make you more effective once you engage in the public arena. The only other thing that I'll mention on this front is there's a lot of ways to make a difference. Running for office is one, but there's, you know, nonprofit organizations, there's getting involved in campaigns, there's getting involved in a board or a commission. And so, you know, my encouragement to you is if you need a little bit of guidance on those fronts, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to my office, and we're more than happy to help you navigate those sorts of steps. Because, you know, frankly, we're going to depend on you all to fix all this stuff. No pressure.
Awesome. And then, yeah, as we wrap up, one last question, and then you can pivot to any closing remarks that you have.
Sure.
So this year, ASUWT has adopted the theme, You Belong Here, as you saw on our walk over here. Can you tell us a bit about what belonging means to you, and specifically in this community?
Yeah. You know, it's funny, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has this saying that she uses often when talking to our Democratic caucus. What she says is, our diversity is our strength and our unity is our power. I really like that because it recognizes that people may come from all over the place and have different backgrounds, different lived experiences, and that diversity is powerful, right? It brings perspectives, it brings knowledge, it brings skills, it brings empathy that is valuable when we're trying to solve problems together. But the second piece of that, I think, is really important too, that recognition that our unity is our power. You know, as the old saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. There is power in unity. And so when I think about you know, we're at a time in our society, we're in a time in our community where division is easy, right? It's easy, you know, the easiest thing to do in politics is to tear something down. It's a lot harder to build something. And to me, part of the value of trying to make sure that there's a home for people, you know, a home on this university campus for people, a home in our community for people, is it's that recognition of the power of building unity. That's something that our office tries to do a lot. You know, I mentioned this effort around bringing together the timber industry and the environmental community. People who have very different perspectives, but that when they got around a table and started listening to each other a little bit more, we found that there was some common ground, that people belonged around that table even if they may have come to the table with different perspectives. I'm part of a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group. It's a group of about a dozen Democrats and about a dozen Republicans who meet for breakfast each week, which is hard sometimes. I mean, I'll tell you what, there have been weeks this year, it's been really hard to sit down with people who have a very different set of perspectives than I have. But what we found is that good democracy is a little bit like a good marriage or a good relationship. You know, you maybe don't always agree with each other, but you have to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other and not have every interaction turn into the Jerry Springer show. And so we're trying to do that hard work of engaging one another So, I mean, that's kind of my take on this is, I really do think that one of the things that the University of Washington Tacoma does well is it doesn't just welcome diversity, it celebrates that diversity, but it also recognizes the power of belonging and celebrating the unity that we have here in this community and on this campus too. So I tip my hat to you as student leaders and to each of you for being part of that effort.
And then any closing remarks that you have or anything you want to share with the audience, both in person and online?
Sure. Well, one, thanks for inviting me. I'm very grateful. You all have plenty of things that you could be doing rather than listening to your congressman. So I very much appreciate that you're willing to be a part of this today. There's a few things I just want to say in closing. One, part of being engaged in our democracy is also being up to date on what's going on. I do an email newsletter every couple weeks just to let folks know what's going on in our nation's capital. You can sign up for it on my website, which is just kilmer.house.gov. And there's a link for contacts and it says sign up for my newsletter. I'm on Twitter and I kind of stink at Instagram, you guys, but I'm trying to raise my game. But we're so we're on social media if you want to follow kind of what's going on in our nation's capital. We try to push out information to folks just so that they know kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's going on in our nation's capital. Half of my team here in the district does what we call casework, where if you've got an issue with any federal agency, we go to work on your behalf. I met with a group, actually the last time I was on campus was meeting with a group of student veterans. We have a caseworker who's a Navy veteran who works with veterans, and if you're grappling with the VA, we go to work on your behalf. We have caseworkers who work on immigration issues or IRS issues. We had a bunch of people who didn't get their pandemic relief checks, and we worked with them. We have caseworkers who work with the Small Business Administration for entrepreneurs in our community who wanted to tap into some of the resources for the pandemic. I share that with you because we have an amazing team of very talented people who are good at solving problems, less good at solving problems we don't know about. So if you have an issue or if you know somebody, if you have a family member or friend who needs a hand, please get in touch with our office. The final thing I just want to say is keep the faith. I know it's hard to watch our federal government in action. It's both in action and in action. But I'm a big believer that that this will get better. And it'll get better because of you, because of each of you as students. It's why I started my remarks the way I did. The reality is, there are literally things that have been introduced in Congress that we're trying to get done on behalf of the students of this country that originated from your campus. And so don't understate for a second your ability to impact the trajectory of this country with regard to higher ed or a whole bunch of other things too. Your voice really matters, and so I appreciate you letting me come and hang out with you for a little bit. All right, thanks everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Representative Kilmer. We'll make sure to coordinate with your team and get all of your contact info on our social media and on our pages so that anyone who has questions now or later can contact your office. And we appreciate you coming and representing us in Washington, D.C.